Welcome to the Week 7 video lecture for Fish and Wildlife Policy, Programs, and Issues. This week we will explore the two most important pieces of legislation for fish and wildlife management, the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, is one of the first and most significant pieces of environmental legislation enacted in the United States. NEPA provides the basic national charter for protection of the environment. The main purpose of NEPA is to ensure that federal agencies incorporate environmental considerations into their planning and decision-making processes. Additionally, NEPA is intended to ensure that information about environmental effects of an agency's proposal and alternative actions are available to agency decision makers and the public. In order to meet this requirement, federal agencies are required to prepare detailed statements assessing the environmental impact of and alternatives to major federal actions. The statements may take the form of an environmental assessment for comparatively low impact actions or an environmental impact statement. NEPA applies whenever a proposed activity or action is proposed on federal lands, requires passage across federal lands, will be funded in part or in whole by federal money, or will affect the air or water quality that is regulated by federal law. When any one of these four conditions are present, the federal agency with the greatest expertise, regulatory authority, and capacity to manage the NEPA process for the proposed projects becomes the lead agency for that project. If NEPA applies, then the agency must conduct an environmental assessment, EA, to determine if an action may have a significant impact. An environmental impact statement is used by federal agencies in conjunction with other relevant information to plan actions and make decisions. Categorical exclusions are classes of actions that do not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the human environment. Actions that are categorically excluded do not require the preparation of an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. The environmental assessment may determine that proposed actions will have no significant environmental impact. A FONSI, or Finding of No Significant Impact, presents the reasons why an action will not have a significant effect on the human environment. If it is determined that a proposed federal action does not fall within a designated categorical exclusion or does not qualify for a FONSI, then the responsible agency or agencies must prepare an EIS. The purpose of an EIS is to ultimately help public officials make informed decisions that are a reflection of an understanding of environmental consequences and the alternatives available. The primary purpose of an environmental impact statement is to ensure that a full and fair discussion of all significant environmental impacts occurs and to inform decision makers that the public of reasonable alternatives that would avoid or minimize adverse impacts or enhance the quality of the human environment. An EIS is required to describe purpose and need for the actions, the environmental impacts of the proposed action, any adverse environmental consequences that cannot be avoided should the proposal be implemented, and alternatives to the proposed actions, and a list of preparers, agencies, organizations, and persons to whom the statement is sent. With the Endangered Species Act of 1973, Congress expressed concern that many of our nation's native plants and animals were in danger of becoming extinct. The Act recognizes that our rich natural heritage is of aesthetic, ecological, educational, recreational, and scientific value to our nation and its people. The ESA provides broad protection for species of fish, wildlife, and plants that are listed as threatened or endangered in the U.S. or elsewhere. Provisions are made for listing species, as well as for recovery plans and the designation of critical habitat for listed species. The Act outlines procedures for federal agencies to follow when taking actions that may jeopardize listed species and contains exceptions and exemptions. The development of a recovery plan is one of the first steps for species recovery and is a tool to guide the recovery process and measure progress toward recovery. Plans designate critical habitat for the listed species. The determination of critical habitat is one of the most controversial and confusing aspects of the ESA. The designation of critical habitat informs future decisions on proposed actions within these areas, but it does not necessarily prohibit all potentially harmful actions. The purpose of the ESA is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. It is administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Commerce Department's National Marine Fisheries Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service has primary responsibility for terrestrial and freshwater organisms, while the responsibilities of Marine Fisheries Service are mainly marine wildlife such as whales and anadromous fish such as salmon. Under the ESA, species may be listed as either endangered or threatened. Endangered means a species is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. Threatened means a species is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. All species of plants and animals except pest insects are eligible for listing as endangered or threatened. For the purposes of the ESA, Congress defined species to include subspecies, varieties, and for vertebrates, distinct population segments. Candidate species are plants and animals for which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has sufficient information on their biological status and threats to propose them as endangered or threatened under the ESA, but for which development of a proposed listing regulation is precluded by other higher priority listing activities. In the 1990s, Congress sought to develop additional means of conservation for listed species without regulatory actions that could severely limit some land uses. Safe harbor agreements are voluntary agreements between non-federal landowners and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. SHAs encourage landowners to create, enhance, or maintain habitat for threatened or endangered species on their property. Prior to the agreement, landowners and agencies established baseline conditions for the habitat to be capable of supporting the species. The agency provides assurances to the landowners and guarantees that if the conditions of the ESA are met, the landowners will not be subject to any additional requirements than previously agreed upon. For certain candidate species, the Fish and Wildlife Service has developed candidate conservation agreements. Candidate conservation agreements, CCAs, are voluntary conservation agreements between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and one or more public or private parties. The service works with its partners to identify threats to candidate species, plan the measures needed to address the threats and conserve these species, identify willing landowners, develop agreements, and design and implement conservation measures and monitor their effectiveness. Candidate conservation agreements with assurances expand on the success of traditional CCAs by providing non-federal landowners with additional incentives for engaging in voluntary, proactive conservation through assurances that limit future conservation obligations. One of the primary reasons for developing the CCAA program was to address landowner concerns about the potential regulatory implications of having a listed species on their land.